Thank you. I'm going to talk today about the pleasures of everyday life. But I want to begin with a story about a terrible and unusual man. This is Hermann Goering. Goering was Hitler's second in command, his designated successor. And like Hitler, Goering fancied himself an art lover. So throughout World War II, Goering went through Europe, and he stole and extorted and sometimes bought various paintings for his collection. But what he really wanted was a Vermeer. Hitler had two of them, and Goering didn't have any. And he really wanted one. And finally, after years of looking, he found one. He found one from the art dealer Han van Meegeren, who sold him a beautiful Vermeer for what would be now $8 million. And this was Goering's most prized possession. So World War II comes to an end. Goering is captured by Allied forces. He is tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, and he is sentenced to death. Then the Allied forces go through his collection, and they find his artwork, and they go after the people who sold it to him. And ultimately, Van Meegeren is arrested in Amsterdam. Van Meegeren is charged with treason for selling this great Dutch masterpiece to a horrific war criminal, the sentence of which would be death. After 3 weeks in prison, Van Meegeren couldn't take it anymore, and he confessed. He says, "I am guilty, but I'm not guilty of the crime I'm charged with. I did not sell a Vermeer to this horrific Nazi. Rather, I'm a forger. I painted it myself." So nobody believed him, and he said, "I'll prove it. Bring into my prison cell some paint and a canvas, and I'll paint you something as beautiful as the thing which I sold to Vermeer." So they brought him the thing, the paint and the canvas, and he couldn't paint a thing. He said, "I need alcohol and morphine. It's the only way I could work." So they brought him alcohol and morphine, and he painted a gorgeous Vermeer. The charges of treason were dropped. He was charged with the lesser charge of forgery, and he got a one-year sentence and died a hero to the Dutch people. Now, there's a lot more to be said about Van Meegeren, but I want to go back to Goering here. And here's a picture of him talking to his lawyer at Nuremberg. Now, by all accounts, Goering was a terrible man. Even for a war criminal, he was a terrible man. His American interrogators described him as an amicable psychopath. But it's hard not to feel just a little bit of sympathy for him when he heard from his lawyer that his most precious painting was actually a forgery. According to his biographer, he looked as if for the first time he had discovered there was evil in the world. He had discovered, after all, that the painting he thought was that painting he adored and loved, was actually not that at all. It was that, which looked exactly the same, made of the same material, but had a different origin, and the origin mattered. It wasn't just Goering who was startled. Once Van Meegeren went on trial, he couldn't stop talking, and he boasted about all of the paintings that were attributed to Vermeer that he himself had actually painted. And the most shocking news of all came with the painting called The Supper at Emmaus, which was thought by many to be Vermeer's finest work. When it turned out it wasn't painted by Vermeer at all, but by Van Meegeren, it was removed from the museum and put into storage. Suddenly it lost all value. Now, I'm a psychologist. There was that painting instead of the first painting. I'm a psychologist, and I'm interested in the psychology of pleasure, and why does the origin of an artwork matter so much when it comes to how much we like it? And what I want to suggest is that this isn't special to art. What I want to suggest is that our obsession with the deeper nature of things extends to pleasure more generally. The way I like to put it is that we are natural-born essentialists. And what that means is that when we get pleasure from something, we don't just respond to what it looks like or feels like or tastes like. Rather, we respond based on what we believe to be its deeper essence, its deeper nature. In other words, I like to suggest that pleasure is deep. And I like to suggest that it's not just deep for sort of higher level pleasures like art, but even for pleasures that you might think are fundamentally simple. To put it a different way, even simple pleasures aren't really that simple after all. So take as a first example the case of food. How do you make children not only be more likely to eat carrots and drink milk, but to enjoy carrots, to say it tastes better, that the carrots taste better, the milk tastes better. It's actually very simple. You remove them from a McDonald's bag. Children believe McDonald's food tastes good, and their belief transforms their experience. How do you make adults think that wine tastes better? It's quite simple. You pour it from an expensive bottle. This experiment's been done dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. The very same wine is poured from a bottle with a label that says it's expensive, like Grand Cru, versus a label that says it's cheap, like Vin Ordinaire. We enjoy it much more when we think it's expensive wine. Now, a skeptic might say, maybe we're not enjoying it more, maybe we just say we're enjoying it more because we want to show off, we don't want to appear naive. But there's some evidence from cognitive neuroscience that this difference is real. So this is from an fMRI study. You have people in the scanner, and they're leaning back, and there's a tube in their mouth, and they're sipping wine through the tube. And as they're sipping wine, information about the wine is showing up on a screen over their head. It's always the same wine, but if they think they're drinking the expensive stuff, they say they like it more, and the parts of their brain associated with pleasure light up like a Christmas tree, suggesting it's a real difference in pleasure. Take sex. This is an attractive man and an attractive woman. I know this because we've used these pictures in our studies, and people say that they're pretty attractive. But how attractive you find them depends critically on who you think you're looking at. You probably believe the person on the left is male and the person on the right is female, but if that belief turns out to be wrong, it will make a difference in how attractive you find these people. It'll make a difference if you discover that they're much younger or much older than they look. It'll make a difference if, as you are looking at them with romantic and sexual interests, you discover that you're looking at pictures of your mother or father, or your son or your daughter. You might still find them attractive, but that will typically kill romantic and sexual desire. It'll also make a difference how much you like them. So one of the nicer studies from psychology is that the more you like somebody, the better they look to you. This could explain a mystery, which is why spouses in a happy marriage tend to believe their husbands and wives look better than anyone else believes they do. And this is because they love them. It's not as if she says, oh, my husband, he looks like a toad, but I love him so. Rather, if you love him, he doesn't look that much like a toad. As a third, so as Shakespeare put it, love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind. As a third example, consider consumer products. One reason we might value objects is because of what they could do for us, because of their utility. You could wear shoes on your feet, you play golf with golf clubs, and chewed up bubble gum doesn't do anything for you at all. But each of these three objects has value above and beyond its utility. The golf clubs were owned by John F. Kennedy and sold for $750,000. The bubble gum was chewed by Britney Spears and sold for a couple of $100s on eBay. And the shoes may be the most valuable of all. According to a New York Times report, a Saudi millionaire offered $10 million for these pair of shoes. And these were the shoes that were thrown at George Bush at an Iraqi press conference. Now, in collaboration with my colleagues, George Newman and Gil Diesendruck, we did an experiment to start to study the mechanisms of contagion. So we asked our subjects to name somebody that a living person they most admired in the world. Some of our subjects said, George Clooney. He said, okay, George Clooney, how much would you pay for a sweater that was worn by George Clooney? And the answer is a lot. People would pay an average of $135, which is more than they would pay for a sweater that was brand new or owned by somebody else. Now, you might say that's just because people want to boast that they own the sweater, or they might want to resell it to a collector. So we had another study where we told people you could buy the sweater from George Clooney, but the conditions are you can't resell it and you can't tell anybody you bought it. And when you do that, the value drops a little bit. But what really makes the value drop is another condition. So we tell people you could buy the sweater, it was worn by George Clooney, you could sell it, you could tell everybody about it, but before it gets to you, it's thoroughly washed. That causes the value to drop significantly. As my wife put it, you've washed away the Clooney cooties. So let's go back to art. I think a lot of the pleasure we get from an artwork is predicated on our beliefs about its hidden nature, how it came into being. So take as an example, this is a work by Jackson Pollock. How many people here like the work of Jackson Pollock? Raise your hand, please. How many people it does nothing for you? Okay, I'm going to say nothing about who's right, but I will make this point. How much you like to Jackson Pollock will depend a lot on how difficult and intricate and creative it is to make such an artwork. If you think your child could do it by throwing paint onto a canvas, you're not likely to appreciate it, while if you think this is a difficult, deliberative, and complicated work, it will give you more pleasure. Sometimes this focus on history can go to extremes. And my favorite example of this is a modernist composition by John Cage called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. In this composition, a pianist goes up to a piano, sits down, opens up the piano, and sits for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and does nothing. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Now, people have different opinions about this work, but what strikes me as fascinating is you can actually buy this on eBay. On iTunes. So, for a small sum, you could own that 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence. Now, of course, if you just want silence, you could just sit still and do nothing. But it's that silence with that history that gives it a certain value. Now, I've talked a lot about pleasure, but in the next 42 seconds, I want to talk briefly about pain. So it turns out that our belief about the nature of things can not only affect the pleasure we get, but also the pain. In experiments where people get electrical shocks, the shocks hurt more if you believe they're done malevolently than done by a random machine. And under some conditions, pain can transform into pleasure if you have the right degree of control over it, as in the pleasurable burn of chili peppers or the exhilaration of a roller coaster ride. In general, then, I think much of our pain and much of our pleasure is nicely summarized by a quote from the poet John Milton, who wrote, "The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." And I'll end with that. Thank you.